Number 9. Monsell Fort's Sealand. Great Britain's Thames and Mersey estuaries are home to a series of conspicuously out-of-place decaying towers known as the Monsell Forts. Built in 1942, they were used by the British Army and Navy to protect vital shipping lanes from the Germans throughout World War II. The forts were built offshore and sunk into place. Each Navy fort was 7 stories and could accommodate up to 120 sailors, while the Army forts were constructed in groups in a futuristic architectural style and were often connected by walkways. After the war ended, the British no longer had any use for the Monsell forts, and they were abandoned in 1950. Several of the towers were occupied and repurposed by pirate radio broadcasters over the following decade, but most were eventually left behind and are unusable today due to their state of decay. One exception is the so-called Principality of Sealand, a self-proclaimed state that declared its independence in 1967 after its founder, Paddy Roy Bates, moved there to air his pirate radio station. Located off the Essex coast, roughly 7.5 miles from the nearest land, the fort was originally called HM Fort Ruffs. Sealand has its own hierarchy, flag, and currency. Most governments, including Great Britain, don't recognize its sovereignty, but nobody goes out of their way to interfere with it either. It consists of 2 towers which house a gym, a chapel, living quarters, and even a jail cell. Bates once held an invading German intruder in the jail cell for 3 months, releasing him only after a diplomat was sent to negotiate his return. At its peak during the 1970s, Sealand boasted around 50 residents. The fort remains under the care of Bates' son Michael, who lives there part-time, and as adult children are also actively involved in Sealand's day-to-day operations. Number 8. Indiana Army Ammunition Plant. As it started to seem increasingly likely that the United States would eventually enter World War II, the government began to mass-produce war material. In 1940, officials announced the construction of the world's first smokeless powder factory along the Ohio River near Charlestown, Indiana. By May of 1941, the sprawling facility consisted of 800 operational buildings spread out across 3 plants and employed over 27,000 workers, vastly outnumbering Charlestown's population of around 900 at the time. While many employees rented rooms in town by the shift or lived in one of the 17 trailer parks that were built to accommodate the sudden influx of new residents, high-ranking officials and their families lived in a newly built village called River Ridge, where they had access to a pool, community center, baseball diamond, basketball courts, playgrounds, and more. In addition to producing smokeless powder, the plant manufactured nitroglycerin, rocket propellant, and other explosive and projectiles. After the war, the majority of the workers were laid off while a skeleton crew continued to operate the facility. The factory was used on and off until the Gulf War, including during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, but production never reached World War II levels and officially ceased in 1992. More recently, cleanup efforts have worked to safely dispose of hazardous materials that were left behind when the factory was abandoned, and the government has started tearing the remaining structures down. Number 7. Lourdes Listening Station. During the early 1960s, the Soviet Union built an intelligence facility near Havana, Cuba, called the Lourdes Signal Intelligence or SIGINT Station. Located less than 100 miles from Key West, the 28-square-mile site was the largest Soviet facility of its kind outside Russia. At its peak, the station employed as many as 1,500 Soviet, Cuban, and Eastern Bloc technicians, engineers, and intelligence operatives. It was once capable of monitoring various forms of commercial and government communications throughout the southeastern U.S. and perhaps elsewhere in the country, as well as correspondence between America and Europe. But these capabilities eventually diminished when the vast majority of American telecommunications stopped traveling via microwave radio. In 2000, news reports claimed that China had struck a deal with Cuba to use part of the facility, but it closed down the following year when Russia could no longer afford the $200 subsidy it had given to Cuba every year since 1962 in exchange for use of the property. Then U.S. President George W. Bush took the decision as a reassuring indicator that the Cold War was over and that America and Russia were no longer adversaries, although he may have been wrong about that last part. In 2014, the media reported that there were plans to reopen the spy base. Putin denied these claims, stating that he could meet Russia's defense needs without using the station. While there are no up-close images of the base, it certainly looks abandoned and overgrown in photos captured from afar. Number 6. Doel. Situated next to a nuclear power station north of Antwerp along the banks of Belgium's River Scheldt, Doel was once home to around 1,300 residents. Today, only 20 or so people remain as they fight to continue the town's 700-year history. Authorities condemned Doel in the 1970s to make room for the expansion of a port at Antwerp. Residents steadily moved out over the following years, with the majority of those left taking a voluntary payout in exchange for their cooperation during a renewed effort to empty the village during the 1990s. But a handful of people refused to leave, forcing the government to put its construction plans on hold. In the meantime, nearby building projects continued right up to Doel's perimeter, leaving it surrounded by factories, container docks, and other industrial fixtures. Demolition began in 2008, but was soon put to a halt when a court ruled against allowing authorities to kick people out of their homes. In recent years, the Flemish government altered its plans so that there's no longer a need to tear Doel down, marking an unlikely victory on behalf of average people who stood up against money and power. But the town's future remains uncertain. Officials don't seem too enthusiastic about the idea of repopulating the town to its former numbers, and its buildings are falling into a worsening state of decay from decades of neglect. But Doel's residents can at least rest assured that their homes won't be torn down. If the government ordered your town's residents to leave, would you be one of the few holdouts who fight and stay, or would you accept a payout and leave? Let us know in the comments below. Number 5. A dictator's isolated villa. For a 40-year period lasting from 1945 to 1985, dictator Enver Hoxha ruled over Albania with an iron fist, turning the country into one of the world's most isolated and politically repressive states. He spent the last 10 years of his reign ruling from the comfort of a luxurious 3-story villa that was located in the heart of the capital Tirana, yet closely guarded from the public. Hoxha died in 1985, and the villa has remained largely untouched ever since. It still contains all its original furnishings and artwork. Books still line shelves, vintage televisions and vases of fake flowers sit on glass and wooden tabletops, and even the floral patterned bedspreads look like they came straight out of the 1970s. Only top-ranking officials had any hope of catching a glimpse of the mansion, and it's remained under close guard and closed to the public ever since Hoxha's death. In recent years, photos have emerged showing the villa's spacious and sprawling interior, which includes an indoor pool, soundproof bedroom doors, and no shortage of rooms filled with elegant plush furniture, ornate light fixtures, and long, sweeping curtains that automatically draw a visitor's attention to how big each room is. In 2019, Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama told The Guardian that he isn't sure what to do with the opulent home. Considering Hoxha's legacy of human rights abuses, it's hard to say whether it's appropriate to destroy the house or preserve it for historical purpose at the risk of seeming like a shrine to a dictator. What do you think should happen to the villa? Let us know in the comments below and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 4. E.J. Roy Building. Located in the heart of the commercial district in Liberia's capital city Monrovia, the Edward James Roy, or E.J. Roy Building, is in an obvious state of ruin. It's clear, just by looking at the crumbling structure, which has trees growing on parts of its rooftop, that it hasn't been used in years. Built in 1964, the high-rise functioned as the first official headquarters of Liberia's true Whig Party, which dominated the country's politics from 1878 to 1980. The building was named after Liberia's 5th president, who, like many other Liberian citizens, emigrated to the colony during a 19th century movement to relocate African Americans out of the United States. Roy borrowed punishing loans from the British for the development of badly needed infrastructure and defaulted on the payments, plunging Liberia into a financial crisis. He was ultimately overthrown, but was remembered as a hero among many who shared his political sentiments. During its heyday, the E.J. Roy Building housed a grand auditorium that was used for important meetings and conventions, but its glory days came to a screeching halt in 1980, when the indigenous factions of soldiers under the command of Master Sergeant Samuel Doe assassinated the country's president and staged a violent coup d'etat against the true Whig Party, bringing an end to its century-long rule. Doe became the new president, and the E.J. Roy Building was abandoned. It was handed over to a government agency, but fell into such disrepair that it was slated for reconstruction. Since then, it's remained at the center of a tug-of-war between the government and true Whig Party, who want to reclaim it as their headquarters. For now, it remains disused and in an ever-worsening state of decay as it languishes with an unknown future. Number 3. Colina Kappa Astronomical Observatory. Before World War I, an Austro-Hungarian military fortress was built atop Mount Trebevic in what is now Bosnia and Herzegovina. Known as Bistrik Kula, its positioning offered an unobstructed view of the city of Sarajevo. After World War II, the fortress lost its military importance and was handed over to the Orion Astronomical Society during the 1960s. The group spent the next few years installing the latest technology at what eventually became the Colina Kappa Observatory. It was the only facility of its kind when it opened in 1972, consisting of 3 domes for observation and a reference library and photo lab on the lower levels. The observatory also contained a fully stocked living quarters with enough supplies to accommodate a several-day stay. Sadly, the site was destroyed between 1992 and 1995 during the Bosnian War, and there wasn't enough money to replace the damaged equipment and buildings. The crumbling, disused structures still overlook Sarajevo today, representing a sad reminder of when the region's century-old tradition of studying the skies came to an end. Many people would like to see the observatory restored. Money is still an issue, but ongoing efforts to bring astronomy back to the country have gained some promising traction in recent years. Whether that means anything for Colina Kappa remains to be seen. Number 2. Kelvedon Hatch Nuclear Bunker. Built in Essex, England during the early 1950s as part of a bigger effort to improve Britain's air defense network, the Kelvedon Hatch secret bunker initially functioned as an operations center for the London sector of the Royal Air Force Fighter Command. In the early 1960s, it became the regional government's designated headquarters for operating underground in event of a nuclear attack. The 3-story bunker's entrance is disguised by what looks like an ordinary house. Inside, there's an opening to a 100-yard tunnel leading 125 feet underground to the shelter's bottom floor. Like most British Cold War-era bunkers, Kelvedon Hatch was equipped with its own electricity, water, and communication systems and was capable of operating independently from the outside world. It could accommodate up to 600 occupants for up to 3 months at a time. The bunker was decommissioned during the early 1990s after the Soviet Union fell and the threat of nuclear war diminished. It was sold back to the family that owned the farmland that it was built on, which the government had acquired through eminent domain, and was renovated and reopened as a Cold War museum. Number 1. Batstow Village. Deep in New Jersey's heavily forested Pine Barrens region is a perfectly preserved 18th century industrial ironworking settlement called Batstow Village. Chosen for its bog ore and other natural resources, the site was established in 1766 by an ironmaster named Charles Reed, and it remained in operation for over a century. During the Revolutionary War, the facility produced iron for the Continental Army while evading detection by the British thanks to its remote location. Workers lived in homes built on the property, which also consisted of stables, a carriage house, a sawmill, a blacksmith, and other buildings. The owner of the ironworks lived in a nearby mansion that still stands today, and there was also a general store and a post office. When the demand for iron dropped in the mid-19th century, Batstow was repurposed as a glass-making facility, but it wasn't very successful, and after its last owner died in 1909, the land was held in a trust until the state bought it in 1954. Batstow's population only decreased throughout the 20th century, with the last resident leaving in 1989. Over 40 of the property's original buildings have been restored, making a visit to the town feel like a literal step back in time. The local church, which was built in 1908, and the post office remain in use to this day. Thanks for watching. Which of these incredible abandoned places shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.